Happy World Carnivorous Plant Day! This is Leah.
And I'm Matt.
With flytrapstore.com. And we are here to do a video for you on myths and misconceptions about Venus flytraps. It should be very helpful for you. So I'm going to be asking Matt questions, and while he's unpotting his mother pot here because he needs to work and teach.
I figured I'd keep my hands busy while we're talking. So.
Yeah. We'll be talking about misconceptions. I'll be asking the questions and Matt will be answering. All right, so we've got the first question or myth about carnivorous plants. I should say specifically flytraps. That they are, quote, jungle plants. You know, that they live in these dark ponds and have tendrils and fanged teeth. And Matt wants to clear that one up for you and why that's a problem to think that about them.
So Venus flytraps actually grow in a temperate zone in the United States near North Carolina, the area of Wilmington, as far north as Southern Virginia and down into South Carolina also. And they live in areas called Pocosin. They're kind of like bog-like areas, low-lying areas with standing water around. And the flytraps actually grow kind of near the standing water in a pine savanna area that's always kind of damp, but they don't sit in water per se in their natural habitat. And they definitely have very cold winters. I mean, Wilmington, you can look up the weather there. It can get down into the teens or even single digits on occasion. So they're definitely not tropical and not jungle plants.
And why would it be a problem to think that in terms of care?
Well, because they do need a rest period. I've seen reports of people growing them year-round indoors under lights, and it seems like you can kind of get them to divide rapidly enough on occasion that it won't outright die, but they definitely do a lot better with a little bit of a rest period in the winter. It doesn't have to be too long or too cold, but they definitely do come back bigger and better the next year if you give them a sufficient time to rest a little bit. So these guys I'm uprooting are actually just starting to break dormancy. They're still hunkered down pretty tight, but they went through their dormancy, and this year they're going to be massive plants. This is a pot full of SD Pronos, and I'm going to break these apart and I'll show you what it looks like whenever you grow plants with optimal moisture levels and in a large enough pot to let them reach their maximum size.
Okay, so the comment about moisture levels brings me back to the whole jungle idea. So people, if you think that flytraps live normally in these jungles that are just like in this extremely, you know, pond-like area, then you think you need to have them in water all the time. Now, is that true?
Well, they absolutely have to be damp all the time. The soil needs to have some moisture level to it. But I think it's much more common for people to overwater them than it is for them to be underwatered. So if you look at the soil, you can see if I squeeze it, no water comes out of it. If you touch it, it feels damp to the touch, but it's certainly nowhere near wet. You can see, you shake it off, it's a little moist, and this is almost perfect moisture level for Venus flytraps. It's damp, but it's nowhere near wet. Like, you know, it's not dripping wet. And if you looked at, let's pull out one of these big boys. So these flytraps, they can get pretty substantial root systems, and whenever you get something like this, and you can see the tips of these roots are white and quite healthy, and all the way down to the bottom of the pot, basically. So I could actually even put them in a larger pot, and they'd get even bigger. But the advantage of having a huge root system is it makes the plant more resilient and more I guess they just have the potential to grow larger with a nice, healthy, well-developed root system. So. And
you're saying a well-developed root system occurs because you're not overwatering it?
Yeah, if you keep them too wet, typically, you know, especially in like these smaller pots, if you leave them sitting in water all the time, you know, this is only about a 3-inch deep pot, 3.5-inch deep pot. If you leave them sitting in an inch of water, the roots won't go any more than to the water, and that's all the larger they'll get, or all the deeper they'll get in the pot. But if, you know, you let them do what they can do with a long root system like that, you'll end up getting much larger rhizomes, which leads to just a larger plant in general.
And then what if you just left them sitting in water all the time, even when it was cold and there wasn't much light out or wind?
It can lead to rot problems. It really kind of depends on the climate, because I know growers down south I've seen some really awesome growing plants down in Florida, and they leave them. The growers would leave them sitting in water all the time. We've moved around a bit since we started growing. So we've lived in Colorado, in Oregon, and now we're in Missouri, and each climate is slightly different. In Oregon in particular, we would have a lot of issues with rot if we left them sitting in water because the nights were always cold. Even in the middle of summer, we get down into the 50s typically at night, and that's just, if you leave them sitting in water when it's in the 50s, it really can lead to problems fairly quickly.
Okay, so if you think that they're a jungle plant, that's a problem because you're not going to be getting, based on that assumption, you won't be getting them enough light. You need a lot of direct light, and you will be giving them potentially too much water, which could lead to rot and will lead to not very great root development.
And the fact that a jungle is a tropical area, and these are actually temperate plants that get a rest period in the fall and winter.
Right, also known as a dormancy. Okay, so the second myth that we hear of a lot and people say a lot is that fly traps should be in a terrarium, that they need a ton of humidity and they should be in a terrarium. What do you think about that?
Fly traps do grow slightly better with fairly high ambient humidity. Somewhere between 60 and 80% ambient humidity seems to be their sweet spot. But again, we've lived several places where the humidity is quite low. For example, Oregon, again, was probably the most challenging climate to grow them in that we've lived in. And the humidity regularly in the summer, we get down into the low 20% relative humidity range, sometimes in the teens. And as long as the soil's damp, they'll actually grow quite well without high humidity. If you let them get dry and there's no humidity, they can kill them very quickly. But the idea that they absolutely need humidity to do well, and in a terrarium setting, is a definite myth. In particular, a terrarium, you don't have very good air movement, and you tend to get a lot of accumulation of minerals because usually terrariums don't drain, and you also get an accumulation of mold spores and other unhealthy things that will eventually lead to unhealthy conditions that can cause crown rot or root rot or just toxic mineral levels. So even in a greenhouse, you have a little less air movement, but outdoor growing, the sun directly hitting them with UV rays kills a lot of bacteria and mold. The wind blows it away, the rain washes it away. So, you have a more dynamic environment, whereas if you're growing in a terrarium, it's quite static, and that leads to all kinds of issues eventually. It's not to say that it can't be done, it's just much more challenging to grow in an environment like that, and it's not necessary. So, avoid the issues and grow plants, if possible, outside. If you live in a challenging environment, it might be necessary to give them some sort of shelter, but ideally they get outdoor full sun and have natural rain fall on them and that sort of thing. It leads to healthier plants and prevents a lot of issues.
Right, and oh my gosh forbid you put that terrarium out in the sunshine. That would be way too hot.
It becomes an oven, basically.
Yeah, an oven. So yeah, that's why you don't want, for example, a glass pot for your fly trap.
Any kind of clear container, whether it be a potting container or a growing chamber, you do not want to put a clear chamber or a clear pot in sunlight. It'll just cook the soil or cook the plant itself. So yeah, that's definitely to be avoided.
We don't want to do that to our little buddies. Okay, here's another one. We've got lots of emails about this, pictures of fly traps not doing well, and people saying, well, I like bottled water, so I gave my fly trap bottled water. In other words, like a Dasani or some kind of water with special minerals added for the humans. So is bottled drinking water that's made for humans, is it good for fly traps?
In general, no. So bottled water can encompass a wide range of things, and it's important to note the distinction between bottled like drinking water and bottled distilled water or bottled reverse osmosis water. So for example, Dasani and other brands like that tend to add minerals for taste, and it tastes good to humans, but unfortunately what they add is typically toxic, even in fairly small doses at low levels to Venus flytraps. So Generally, you want to give them mineral-free water or low mineral water, and in particular, the minerals you want to avoid are calcium and magnesium, which is very common in a lot of tap waters. Here, where we're at in Missouri, unfortunately, the groundwater filters through a lot of limestone bedrock, which contains a high amount of calcium. So our tap water here, if you take a TDS meter, total dissolved solids, measure it from the tap, it's typically in the 300 to 400 range, which is very toxic to fly traps, and it's almost entirely calcium. So we can't use tap water here, unfortunately. So we collect rainwater, which is fairly easy in most cases. Just tap into a downspout. But you can also buy distilled water or reverse osmosis water fairly inexpensively at most big stores.
Right. And the water we have here in Missouri is well water. So well water is very rarely good for fly traps. It's, you've drilled down into the minerals, and the fly traps don't.
Where we were living in Oregon and in Colorado, both the tap waters there were good. I think it was largely because the surrounding area, in terms of rock, geology, was largely granitic, meaning granite rock. And granite is not water soluble. And so most of the water coming out of the tap in Oregon and Colorado was in the 50 ppm. So in that case, you could use it, and we did use tap water. But if you want to use tap water, I'd caution to make sure you test it first. And you can get a TDS meter at a variety of places for about $15 or less. So.
Okay. Now, how about food? Humans, a lot of humans like hamburgers. Should you feed human food? Here's the myth that fly traps want to eat human food because humans like human food. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, no.
Please don't.
Please don't do that. It won't kill the plant entirely, but it will definitely, you'll kill a trap. If you try to feed it any kind of meat, such as beef or chicken or, anything like that, it will kill the trap. They won't be able to digest it properly. The enzymes that they secrete are basically evolved to digest the exoskeleton of insects. So basically what they release is a chemical called chitinase, and the exoskeleton of a insect is chitin. So it breaks down that exoskeleton and allows the soft parts of the insect to get absorbed into the trap for nutrition uptake. And that's essentially what they're after when they're catching insects. So feeding them meat doesn't work out for them. It basically just rots the trap, and then you lose it.
Okay, sounds good. So then what should you feed them, or do you feed them at all, or do you have to feed them?
You can feed them, and they actually do grow much faster, and I wish I could spend enough time feeding all these plants every day.
There's so many, you guys.
Unfortunately, I don't have that kind of time, and no, we don't typically feed our fly traps. So I do on occasion baby a plant or two to try to get it to size more quickly, but it is not necessary. And if you do feed them something like rehydrated freeze-dried bloodworms or any kind of dehydrated insects rehydrated, works fairly well. Things that are too tough I would recommend against, like crickets, anything with a really, really hard shell, they can't break down quickly enough before the trap will rot. But any kind of soft-bodied insect, flies obviously are ideal. Anything along those lines works great for feeding them.
Okay. And the next myth is that fly traps like fertilizer, kind of like a tomato. That's a myth, right?
Well, I have tried various fertilizers over the years, and I've had not much success with them. They can take up a little bit of fertilizer, but we typically recommend, if you want to fertilize them, just spending the time to feed them. Because the results I've seen, typically the carpet moss just accelerates in growth, and the plants really don't show much response to it. I know that a lot of people have had success, and maybe I'm just not doing it right, but the plants certainly, as you can see, these plants, I have never been fertilized, and they just, that's a big, big, healthy Venus fly.
Huge. What
it's
is
the big
that rhizome? It's like an inch
yeah,
and
it's
a half.
an inch and a half or
ridiculous.
almost 2 inches. So you don't need to fertilize them. They will grow quite well without fertilizer, and they're quite good at catching their own meals if you have them outdoors or in a greenhouse with the doors open. Bugs will come in and they will catch their own food. So
Okay.
If you do want to feed them, you can do it, but definitely you don't need to fertilize them.
Okay. How about the winter time? A lot of people will write us and say that their fly trap died in the winter. So I think there's a myth that fly traps die in the winter.
Well, as mentioned before, they are temperate plants and they do go dormant in the fall. And it can look quite shocking when you see them shed all of their summer traps. In the winter, they grow very low with no long traps. You might want to grab a pot behind you to show what the spring growth looks like.
Oh yeah, I love the spring growth. It just pops right out.
So those guys just started flowering a bit, and then you can see the upright traps there on the spring growth.
Yep.
And so they grow
straight up
upright in the spring and summer, and then all those traps that you see right now that are upright, by the time fall rolls around, typically turn black and die. And it kind of covers up all the green part of the plant, which looks quite bad. And a lot of people mistake that for either a sick fly trap or something dying. So they do die back, but they don't die. Basically, they turn into a bulb and either stay really low to the ground, and some varieties go almost entirely underground, and then come back in the spring.
Okay. So it's mostly the tall trap. What is that, a bird stuck in the greenhouse?
I don't know, a bird or some sort of big bug.
That's another myth. The Venus flytraps will hurt you and can catch large things like frogs or birds. Nope, that's not true. Look out, bird. Okay, so another myth that we have, and we're almost done here, is that the flower stalks are so pretty. You should just leave them be and enjoy the flower stalks. That's a myth, because why?
Well, if you have a big healthy plant, such as the one I was showing just a minute ago, it's fine to let it flower, especially if you want to cross-pollinate it, or they're actually self-fertile, so they can be self-pollinated, but they don't self-pollinate naturally. But in general, we typically recommend people cut off the Venus flytrap's flower stalk, just because they do expend a lot of energy flowering, and if it's not a optimally healthy plant, it can set it back a lot or even potentially kill it. So anything we don't want to gather seed from, we'll typically snip the flower stalk off of, and we recommend people do the same. But if you're confident that your plants are healthy and you would like to get some seed, it's totally fine to let them flower.
For some reason, I've noticed the fused tooth stalk grows so huge. We've had fused tooth die from their, I don't know, some of them in particular too have a certain response to the flower stalk. It's very interesting.
Yeah, each flower stalk on each variety of flytrap is slightly different. Even the flowers look different. The color of the flowers can be different, the shape of the flowers. And yes, some varieties tend to put up huge flower stalks. The one I'm repotting right now, for example, Kronos, is one of those that puts up huge, very thick, big flower stalks. And these are from last year. I did let them go to seed. So as you repot, typically what happens is once you let them go to flower, that growth point usually, but not always, will die, and you'll end up with a bunch of smaller plants around it. So you can see this was a huge plant last year. Now there's a teeny tiny plant where the flower stalk actually emerged from, and this plant and this plant and more and more plants all came off that that one main crown that sent up that flower stalk. So yes, generally we recommend cutting flower stalks, but if you're healthy, if your plant's healthy and you're confident in what you're doing, feel free to let them flower and pollinate and get some seed.
Okay, so the last one, which is just sort of a summary. A lot of people think that Venus flytraps are hard to take care of, that they die easily. What do you think of that?
Well, as with most living things, there are certain ways that are very easy to kill them. In general, if someone knows how to grow plants, I consider flytraps on the easier end of the scale for cultivation. Typically, there's just a few mistakes that we've already mentioned that can easily kill them. Lack of sunlight, wrong type of water, keeping them too wet in a cool climate, those sorts of things can lead to death quickly. But generally, flytraps are one of the easier carnivorous plants to cultivate. You just have a few strict rules that you have to follow, and if you can do those, you can grow. This pot last year was maybe 8 or 10 big plants, and I've already separated probably 40 divisions. So they divide quickly if you take good care of them.
So you can have flytraps and their offspring as buddies for life.
That's right. Yeah, the oldest known flytrap in cultivation is the Bob Zemer 1955 clone, and Bob is a longtime International Carnivorous Plant Society member and newsletter editor. So, and I visited Bob, and he gave me a nice big clump of his 1955 clone, and it's an historic clone that I'm very happy to still grow.
That is very cool. Ending on that note. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Yeah, happy World Carnivorous Plant Day, everybody.
Happy World Carnivorous Plant Day from Matt and Leah at Flytrap Store. Later.
It's not a surprise that gardeners, educators, and scientists are fascinated by these unique plants. The International Carnivorous Plant Society, or ICPS, not only love these plants, but welcomes growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. The ICPS even started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate them. The free online event is held the first Wednesday of May. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.